This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, and my guest this week is someone that you will know and have followed for many years. It's award-winning journalist Ray Martin, and I'm looking forward to catching up with Ray and to hear his stories about covering over the last 50-odd years some of the key moments in history. I think it's going to be a really great conversation. And Ray, it's just a real pleasure to have you here on the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
Now, I think let's kick off. Before we get started, I wanted a bit of an announcement for people that we're going on a tour together, aren't we? We're heading to the Western Front. And
we've done it once before.
We've done it. We have done Gallipoli, and so this is a follow up from our trip in 2015. We are going next year in June to the Western Front. We'll be going together and exploring some of those key Australian battlefields. What does that mean to you to be able to go and walk this ground and explore this vital, important chapter of history?
Yeah, it's very. I was going to be a history teacher. I did history honours at Sydney University, and I was going to be a history teacher or lecturer, and then jumped the fence and become a journalist. But part of my journalism is, in fact, most books I read are about history. I've become a bit of a nut on early Australian colonial history now, the first sort of 40 or 50 years. So when I went to America for the ABC, 69 to 78, I had studied American history at university, and I was pretty familiar with the battlefields and pretty familiar with early American colonial history. So to walk the graveyards of New England, to walk the battlefields of the Civil War were extraordinary. I mean, the hair on the back of my neck standing up a bit as I talk about it, because it was things that I'd read in dusty library shelves at Sydney University, and now I was suddenly there. This war is much the same, the First World War and Gallipoli when we went together. I think I said to you at the time that when I went to Gettysburg and went to some of the American great battlefields, extraordinary battlefields, I was moved to begin to understand what was there, but not as much as when I first went to Gallipoli and went up Shrapnel Gully and thought that my own people had been there, Australians as against Americans, and if you know, and when I travel with you, I know much more, but to be filled in and to be familiarised with what these men, in that case, it was only men who went through what they went through. And I think the same as the Western Front. Now, for me, it's what's really exciting about me going to the Western Front is that I've been to Fromelles, and I've certainly been to Ypres, but I haven't been elsewhere, and parts of northern France and parts of Germany. But so I'm the world's best tourist. I mean, I love to go to places the first time, and especially if it's something about our history. So to go to these places, I'm going to be like a kid in a toy shop, and hopefully can enjoy it with other people.
Well, wonderfully as well, you're a very well-respected photographer as well, and you're going to bring your knowledge about photography to the tour as well, aren't you, with a special workshop, and we're going to be encouraging people to bring their cameras and take photos during the tour. That's an important part of not just a holiday experience, but also documenting these visits to important sites of history, isn't it? The ability to take a photo, to share that with people, to help convey this story through photography. That's a really important part of travel, isn't it?
Yeah, the iPhone has obviously put a camera in everybody's hands nowadays, but there are better cameras, and there are better memories as a result of cameras. You don't have to buy an expensive camera, but there are cameras that are meant to take photos rather than use in conversation. But I find when I drive somewhere, whether it be Australia or overseas, if I'm driving, I take more notice of where I am. If I take photographs, I take more notice of where I've been, in that sense. And I think photos are really important as memory triggers, if you like, but also it's hard not to look at a photo and remember the few hours, if not the few minutes, but the few hours that were around that particular photograph. So I think photos are really important. They're important in our lives and our family lives, and so often these days, people tend to leave them on the computer, on the iPhone, rather than, Ken Duncan, the great Australian photographer, says that you don't have a photo till you print it. That doesn't mean you've got to do a big poster-sized print, but at least the little postcards that I used to have and our parents used to have and so on, those size are great memories and mementos and, if you like, reminders of these extraordinary experiences. So given the places we're going to, in this case in the Western Front, I just think to go without a camera is going with one eye closed. I just think it's so important to have a camera. So we had this idea of maybe having, if not every night, a competition and just see, let someone put up their favourite photograph, which may be a very lonely, empty shot at Fromelles, or maybe somewhere else in on that Western Front, where that for the beauty of photography is that you don't have to be good and you don't have to be special. All you've got to do is just record a memory which for you is important, and the chances are it will be very good, even if it's not, as I say, from an aperture point of view or from a speed point of view, what a professional would do. But nevertheless, these wonderful memories that I've seen myself of ordinary people taking with ordinary cameras, and I know we're going to get that. So that's to inspire people to get out there and record what they're seeing, and record something that it was that little corner of that gravestone. It was that of that graveyard. It was that little part of the paddock where, a great uncle disappeared, or where someone from your town disappeared. That's worth recording. It's worth recording and thinking, how am I going to photograph that? How am I going to remember that?
Well, we should remember as well that photography was a hugely important aspect of the First World War. This was one of the first wars, probably the American Civil War was the first war where photography was actively used on the battlefield. But by the time of the First World War, the official war photographer had become a thing, and this was the first time we saw pictures from battlefields. And some of them are actually quite confronting. I'm always astounded when you go back, noting the amount of censorship and the way governments tried to depict the First World War for people at home. I'm always astounded at some of the access that photographers were given, people like Frank Hurley, and some of the access they were given to those battlefields is just extraordinary.
And the soldiers themselves. I mean, to think that you're out there trying to stay alive, and the soldiers and nurses in the hospitals who took cameras back in 1914, 15, 16, 17, through there when the cameras were fairly primitive but still very good if you knew what you're doing. And they took them along with some other mementos from home. And some of them took photographs and they were saved. Somehow, as you said, they got through, and we have found some family photos from the battlefront now. But to have done it then, when you had all the other rest of the clobber to carry with you, it was remarkable.
Well, they weren't allowed to bring cameras either. Amateur photographers were officially banned during the First World War, yet officers in particular would smuggle the box brownie along with them, and thank God they did, because some of the most compelling shots we have now of the battlefields were taken, as you say, by soldiers who were right in the thick of the action.
And even later, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember Winston Churchill and Menzies had cameras with them when they went to World War II sites. I think Churchill took some on North Africa, and that was his own camera. And it helps if you're the Prime Minister, but nevertheless, these were, as you say, usually people who could afford a camera. If you're working class, you probably couldn't afford one, but beyond that, to have one there and secrete it from the officers was great fun.
It's going to be a great trip. So that's to the Western Front. Ray Martin and I'm going to be there doing history stuff. Ray's going to be there sharing with us his wonderful insights into the history and photography, etc. It's going to be great. If you want to come with us, visit the website, of course, like always. And there's lots of spaces, but that's June 2020. That tour will be going. And it's going to be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, please come, because I mean it's war stories there of not just WW1, but the stories that people have of their own families and their own of what they've done themselves, plus a chance to just sort of get to meet people. And I've got obviously stories to tell of my 50 plus years, but I'm really there like everybody else to enjoy and learn from what happened there. But I think together, given what we did in Gallipoli and how much fun we had then with 800 or so people, didn't we? On that occasion, much less than that this time, but a chance to sort of stop and smell the roses.
Yeah, it's going to be great. There's only going to be a couple of coaches this time, so it'll be a much more intimate experience. It's going to be quite a great tour, so go and check out the website for that one. You mentioned the importance of family and storytelling. You were telling me earlier today about growing up all throughout the bush in New South Wales. Just tell us a little bit, before we get to the story of Ray Martin, journalist, tell us about Ray Martin, the kid, growing up in Gunnedah and the various back blocks of New South Wales.
Yeah, my father was a mechanic and had come out of the WW2. He was in the Air Force, and I was born in Richmond because he was based at the Air Force in Richmond. And he then went bush after the war, and he managed a couple of properties and was also working on the building of dams around New South Wales. And for some reason, they needed mechanics in the early stages. So we were very itinerant. I went to, I've got 3 older sisters and no brothers. And we lived we spent a lot of time in trains, going from places to places, and which is about the only transport one had then. And we lived in 13 different towns before I went to high school, and I went to high school in Tassie, as it happened. But so for me, it was, looking back, it was boys' own adventure stuff. I was always, as I say, somehow being looked after by my mother or my father or my sisters in a train somewhere, and getting out of some lonely cold station in Albury or Wagga or these other towns, and it'd be 2:00 in the morning, and I remember vivid memories of railway station coffee, even as a small boy, having coffee then, which I think was just chicory. The point was made about we didn't have coffee in those days; it was just chicory. And I think there was the American writer who came here in the 1800s, and he did a train trip from Melbourne to Sydney, and he was saying that he thought Australian coffee was a mix between sheep dip and sump oil. And we know American coffees nowhere near as good as ours, but at that time our coffee was just chicory. So that's what. But as a kid, you'd get it with a lot of condensed milk in the railway canteens, and I was a little boy with dimples, and if I smiled at the women behind the counter, I'd get extra condensed milk in there, which I used to love, which is nice and sweet. And I remember that vivid memory of some lady sort of tweaking me on the cheek, and he was in a starch white uniform, and she'd give me coffee, even though I was only 6 or 7 or 8 at that stage, just to warm you up with an extra dab of condensed milk in there. But so my memories of travelling around the bush were really good. We were absolutely working class, a sort of Catholic working class Irish background, Aboriginal connection we were to learn later in our lives. My great grandfather on my mum's side had 2 children with a full-blooded Aboriginal woman in northern New South Wales, in Keepit, what is now today Keepit Dam, at Keepit Station, and those 2 children are obviously part of my blood, and I'm very proud of that. We didn't find out till later, but that was part of I suspect there are a lot of people who grew up in the bush who have an Aboriginal connection that hasn't been acknowledged or they don't know about, simply because of the mixing of the races out there. So we grew up, as I say, all the time. I travelled to these different schools. My sisters, who suffered much more as teenage girls, because when you're that age, you don't like to leave friends and change school uniforms and all that sort of stuff. To me, it was just, as I say, my life was just boys' own adventure. I had the most wonderful mother who looked after me, and my elder sisters and dad, and so it was good. Growing up the bush was fun. Had I been older, or my mother, for example, I think went through tyranny almost to change houses, change towns 13 times in 6 or 7 years. But that was life.
How did that upbringing shape your worldview later in life? Do you still see yourself as a kid from the bush? Or?
Yeah, I do. And I still, oddly enough, I still see myself as a working class kid, in the sense that I used to get, my parents split. My father was violent towards my mother when he was drunk. And so I used to do stuff when I was doing midday. I'd do, a current affair, and we'd do something on on domestic violence. And I'd get a letter from some lady in the bush or in the city, and she'd say, good interview on that, but that was also my experience, she'd say, but you could never understand what it was like. And I used to say, write a letter back and say, trust me, I do. I've been poor, and I've been working class, absolute working class. And at one stage, when we came to the city, there was no accommodation in the early 50s in Australia, and two of my elder sisters stayed with my mother's brother and sister-in-law in Paddington, and then the 3 of us my dad and my other sister and my mum and I were staying in whatever we could stay in, and we stayed variously from a houseboat to the Salvation Army residence, and we, for 2 nights, we slept on the station on Central Station, because it was my mum used to take my sisters and myself down to the Housing Commission office every day, and we hadn't registered on the Housing Commission list, so someone down there said to Mum, look, you've got to do something extreme. So we sort of slept on the station for 2 nights. The second night we were picked up by the police and put in the paddy wagon and taken back to the Housing Commission place. And I remember the police saying to my father, what are you doing here? We had our suitcases and we were asleep on the station. And Dad said, we've got nowhere to stay. And so we ended up jumping a train and going out to a housing commission sort of halfway centre out near Liverpool. And we subsequently got a housing commission house, and life moved on. But it was that, I think I remember researching my own story, and there was something like 350,000 people in New South Wales after the war who didn't have houses. And that's when the housing commission business really started. And we were part of it. And so, as I say, it used to be funny when I'd get letters from people saying, you wouldn't understand what it's like to be this. And I said, well, trust me, I do.
How did you go from that remarkable start in life to how did you decide that journalism was what you wanted to do and that was how you're going to make your career?
Yeah, I don't know whether I ever decided. And having said that about my early life, I never felt like I was poor. I never felt deprived. I never went hungry. As I say, I had the most extraordinary mother known to man. And so I didn't know. There didn't seem to be the difference between the rich and the poor in Australia in those days. So I was just like everybody else. I always had shoes to wear and always had clothes to wear, etc. So that was part of the upbringing. But I was lucky enough to go to a selective high school, and then I got a scholarship at the end of that to go to university, and that was there's no way in the world I could have afforded university without a scholarship with my background, and it was an engineering scholarship, and I did a Commonwealth scholarship to do engineering, and I did about 3 weeks of engineering at Sydney University and thought this is the wrong side of the brain. This is engineer ain't me, and so I jumped the fence, and you couldn't transfer Commonwealth scholarships in those days. So once you'd chosen a scholarship, you had to stick with it. But I got an education department scholarship instead, and so decided I'd go and teach. And I was in my honours year of history, as I said, and I decided I didn't want to teach, and so I applied for a job at the ABC as a cadet. And they used to give two scholarships a year or 2 traineeships a year, and I got that particular year, and that was the start of it. But I had no idea what journalism was.
When was this? What era was this, Ray?
65, I started with the ABC. I had been, myself and a mate at Launceston High School, which was a selective school. We ran the school newspaper and the school radio station, mainly because it got us out of assembly. We'd run the microphones and we'd play the records and so on for assembly. We didn't have to sit in the drafty old hall. But also from the newspaper point of view, I was the news and sports editor, and my mate did the other things in the newspaper. And so I could really just boast about my sporting prowess and things that I'd done on the sporting field, way beyond what I'd really done. But that's what you can do when you're a journalist or the correspondent. So that was the only connection we had with journalism, so to speak, and that was done for ulterior motives. But ABC in those days was, we're talking about 1965. I started as a cadet in Sydney and went to Perth and Canberra, and then got the job as New York correspondent in 1969 to 78. Now that was the change of my life, because America in 69 was the start of the civil rights revolution, the feminist revolution, the gay revolution, and the late 60s were revolutionary time in America and in the world, and America led the way, if you like, in the revolution. So I arrived there when things were happening in America, and Vietnam was happening, and Nixon was happening, and Man on the Moon was happening, and et cetera, et cetera. And it seemed like every day there was some new news story that you could get your teeth into. So, the foundations of my life were really just those 10 years in America.
Joining the ABC in the mid-60s, there probably has not been a more tumultuous decade in recent history. I mean, the changes that occurred in the 60s and into the 70s, and especially, as you say, through America, throughout the world, that must have been an absolutely extraordinary time to be a new journalist covering these new stories. It was,
and I'd walked out of Canberra, and I'd been covering politics down there for about 2 years, and we were very much under a British system, but even tighter than that. We are a conservative people, and our journalistic laws were extremely conservative, and the defamation laws and the restrictions on journalism were much tighter than they are today. Although there's an attempt today to try and toughen them up again with present governments, but in those days, I remember going to America, and there was Robert Askin was the New South Wales Premier at the time, and we knew as journalists that he was on the take from money from SB bookies in SB gambling in New South Wales. When you could never report that, even though he was the Premier at the time, and it's since been reported and established as fact. But you had to be careful about what you said about people. And I got to America, and there was a guy named Pete Hamill, who was a wonderful Irish-American writer, probably the most powerful influence on my writing and my thoughts that I'd come across at that stage. And he was living with Shirley MacLaine, Pete Hamill was, and is still alive, and he wrote the first of the covers for Bob Dylan albums and things like this. He was just a most lively, vibrant, beautiful writer. And he wrote a column for the New York Post, which is a paper that Rupert Murdoch has subsequently bought. But at that time, it was run by a smaller liberal Jewish woman in New York, and it had all that sort of the liberalism smaller liberalism of the American Jews, and so it was in the paper, the Post, and he had a column 3 days a week, and I subsequently cut the columns out. It was so starkly different from anything I'd seen in Australia, and he wrote a column about a congressman when I'd been there a week or two, and it was called None, was the top of the column. Each column had a name, and he was Congressman Lester Nunn, who was from Tennessee, and he'd been in the middle. He was a Democrat, but he was in the middle of all kinds of skullduggery and pork barreling, as the Americans called it at that time. But he died. And the opening paragraph in this, after my experience of journalism in Australia and Canberra, was Pete Hamill's opening line was, "They buried Lester Nunn in Tuscaloosa today, full stop, and we're better off without him." And then he just listed the calumnies. He'd listed all the not beyond pork barreling, all the things this guy had done in his life. I couldn't believe it. I mean, for someone coming out of the politics of Canberra, where you really couldn't tell the truth, you had to be careful about it. Suddenly I was in this land of the free. I was in America where they did tell Richard Nixon that he was a crook, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was just, for a journalist, it was, I don't want to go out there calling people crooks when they're not, but it was this freedom of the press that I had only heard about. And I think, as you said, the revolution was being led in America. A bit of it was in France, of course, with civil rights and other rights in France, and certainly some of the youth movement in France and Germany. But America was very revolutionary, and it was. And you don't know at the time. In this history we talk about, that it's usually when you step back and look at a timeline, you realise that when things happen. But as I said, the civil rights movement just blew apart in America. It was, the Black Panthers were a violent revolutionary group in America, and I found myself one night in Harlem, one Friday night, and Jean Genet, the French communist, was there talking to the Black Panthers, and it was 2:00 in the morning. I was in the deepest, darkest part of Harlem, and then the South Bronx, which were very dangerous places in those days. And I was this innocent white kid from Australia, waiting to speak to Jean Genet at 2:00 in the morning with these revolutionary Black Panthers around, and I had no sense of the danger, and it was really serious danger. I mean, probably the FBI and the police forces fought with the Black Panthers, and many were killed. A lot of people were killed on both sides. But that was a sort of it wasn't the sophistication of America that we see today. It was when America was bubbling and breaking apart.
What was that like to be in New York at this time? I mean, we're talking the end of the Vietnam War. We're talking widespread protests, Watergate. I mean, these are all stories I assume you were covering as part of your day-to-day life. That must have been... It must have been exhilarating to be in New York at that time.
And the women's revolution as well. I mean, suddenly Betty Friedan and all these the revolutionaries, if you like, in the women's movement, getting some equal rights for women. The gay movement, the gay equal rights movement began in America again. I mean, there's already places like Holland and others had just accepted it, but the rest of the world still rejected and resented the gay revolution, if you like, and Americans decided to fight it. It was, you were conscious that you were, a phrase I think that Dylan used of being in the belly of the beast. You're conscious that the revolution was happening before you in this highly sophisticated centre of the earth. I mean, it was someone like Jimmy Breslin, the great New York writer. He said, when you leave New York, you go bush. And that was not just in America, but for the rest of the world. Ken Tynan, the English writer, said that, comparing, he grew up in London, he was saying New York was like Technicolor, where London was black and white. And that was the difference in terms of New York leading the world. And there are times when Berlin leads the world and Paris leads the world and London. Well, almost since the end of the war, New York has led the world. And you're conscious that this is where ideas happen, and you're conscious that this is where changes happen. And then you had John Kennedy telling the world that man was going to be put on the moon by the end of the 60s, and it did happen. But that appeared for a young boy growing up in Australia and looking at the moon, and then for a young journalist going to America, I thought, there's no way they're going to do that. But they did, and that's the sort of thing they did.
Ray, did you feel, as a journalist, removed from this revolution that was going on all around you, or did you feel caught up in it? Did you feel part of the story, or were you removed simply reporting on what you saw?
Yeah, I'd love to say I felt part of it. I didn't. All the time, the thing I love about journalism is that when I finished working full-time at Channel 9, I can't tell you the number of letters that I used to get from people saying, it's clear that you're a card-carrying communist, and the others would say, it's clear that you're a right-wing liberal. And I thought, well, I've done a good job. If people have no idea what my politics, because my politics are irrelevant to what I report, what I think, apart from sexism and racism, which are non-negotiable, then I think otherwise what I think doesn't matter. I should just report. So it was only when I wrote my autobiography, when I'd left Nine, and about 2008, that I started to put that timeline in of the 10 years, for example, in America, apart from other things in my life. And I thought, wow, that's when the Kent State killings happened. The Kent State University, where 3 students were shot by American troops in there, and it was a conflagration. It was a riot that was caused by the number 2 in the CIA, James Jesus Angleton, a man whom I spoke to later, who was sacked from the CIA for setting up these agents provocateurs in the universities. Now, it was his people who had set that riot up to make look as though it was a left-wing conspiracy, and the National Guard went in to try and calm it down, and 3 students were shot and killed. We now know it was done by the CIA, and I don't believe in conspiracies generally, so I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that's just a fact of life. So those things were happening, but that was exposed in America. Very few places would it be exposed. It would be somehow swept under the carpet, whether it be Saudi Arabia or France or Germany. In America, they exposed things like this. So you did get Watergate, and you did get the Pentagon Papers, and you get all these things that almost like WikiLeaks today. You got Americans expecting, in the Mueller inquiry, Americans expect to be told the truth. Not that they are all the time, nobody is, but nevertheless, that's what I fell into as a journalist. So I was conscious that I was, covering these stories day by day, and it's all exhilarating and exciting. And as I say, at one stage, I think the ABC instructed me to take some holidays, because we'd built up over 26 weeks of holidays, my wife and I, and it was just, you couldn't go away for a week because you'd miss something would be happening as a journalist, and so we finally were forced to take a month of our holidays. We ended up going around the American Civil War sites on holiday as a result. But it was just so exciting in that period through the 70s, when it seemed like if it wasn't happening in America, then it just didn't happen.
You mentioned the moon landings. What were the other big stories that you covered during that period? Because, as we said, the late 60s into the 1970s, there was just so much. There's something happening every day. Yeah, what were the big stories that stand out in your mind you covered in that time?
I guess certainly even the start of the environmental movement happened in America, and you suddenly became aware of that we were messing up this planet of ours, and yet until today, we don't really, until Europe goes through these sort of heat waves they're having, and the hottest period in the history of Europe, you realise there might be something happening. The barrier reef melting and those sorts of things, we now realise that there is something happening, whether it's man-made or whatever. There is a climate change. That was started in America in the 1960s, late 60s, early into the 70s is when they started to ring the bells, about the alarm bells, about the environment, about lead in water, about all the things that we're doing in the forests, and et cetera, in the oceans. That was really, you couldn't avoid it, and yet you, for a moment, because it was so revolutionary and so new, did people really care? Well, no, they didn't care as much as they care today about that. The same as the women's movement. I mean, you look at the sexism as there was in our lives in Australia or in America or in the Western world. Again, it was very hard to beat that drum for too long, because, all right, we've heard about women. We know that women, even though women even though there was a glass ceiling, even though women were being paid less than men, all those sorts of things. From a news point of view, you can only do things that people are prepared to accept and people want to read and want to listen to. So you couldn't beat that feminist drum for too long before people yawned and said, "Yeah, I've heard all that." It was the same with Aboriginal stories. As a young journalist in Australia through that period that I was growing up, the editor's adage was, blackfellas don't sell newspapers or don't sell ratings, and therefore, unless it happened to be a negative story about Indigenous people, then we don't want a story about abos, that offensive word that was used at the time, and so. There are these changes, and at that stage, civil rights and if you like, black equality was starting to was beginning as a serious story, and I think that we tended to ape that with some of the riots and some of the demonstrations that Indigenous people had in Australia in the 70s as well, because that's what was happening in America, and that's why America was important, and that's where I felt like I was in the belly of the beast, and with the women's movement and the environmental movement and the civil rights movement and the gay movement and etc. on those things. So, but I was always an observer of that. It was I went to the moratorium, the marches, 1 million people walking down the main boulevards in Washington, and so you're aware of all these people who weren't all sort of long-haired, dirty, grubby hippies. They were middle-class Americans who suddenly began to get the message, and that's part of that. The history. And the moments of history that I now look back on, and including the man walking the moon at that time, which I covered almost second by second. And that at the time you think, wow, this is pretty important, but you don't think in 50 years' time, as we have now, we're going to sit back and look at that. And people like the Alis and whom I interviewed, Muhammad Ali, and at the time, and I went to the first fight that Ali had with Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden. I'd been, as a working class boy, I'd been to Sydney Stadium and seen fights with my father, who was keen on fights and the fighting game, and I had grown up with that, seeing it in Sydney Stadium, which was a barn, and then I get to Madison Square Garden, and there are 20,000 people there for the biggest sporting event in the history of the world at that stage. And he was a black man who was fighting an even blacker man, but Frazier, being the blacker man, was almost the great white hope, because Ali had become so controversial. And so here was white America trying to support this very black man named Joe Frazier against this upstart who changed his name and become a Muslim in Ali. And I remember, I sat about 20 rows from ringside in that particular fight, and I'm an absolute sports nut. I love sport. That was not only the biggest sporting event in the history of the world in terms of finances at that stage, with a financial payout to the two men, but I just felt like I'd gone to heaven, and there I was sitting. There was so few seats in that particular fight that Frank Sinatra had to, only way he could get into the fight was as a photographer for Life magazine. He had a tag around his neck with his black suit and a black tie on, sitting in 20 rows in front of me, and it said photographer, and of course he wasn't taking photographs, he just wanted to go to the fight, and there were no seats. And the fight went for 15 rounds. It was a draw. It was a win for Frazier, rather, and both men ended up with broken jaws. And I'm a non-violent person, but it was one of those extraordinary spectacles, if you like, street theatre or theatre in a stadium, that I'd ever seen in my life. And it was, and I was there, and those sorts of things. So I think that's the privilege of being a journalist, but also the privilege of being in America at that time.
You covered, obviously, historic events, a lot of political events, but what about the great cultural things that were going on at the same time? Because you mentioned to me earlier on that you interviewed the Beatles, that there was just such a revolution in popular culture, art, music. Everything was going on in America at the time. How did that feel to be so closely involved in the cultural aspects of that revolution as well?
It was. I mean, once again, New York was the centre of the universe, and America was a wider centre, if you like. But things could happen in like the Rolling Stones in Altamont, the big riot that ended up with a couple of people stabbed at that Rolling Stones concert in California, was on the other side of the country, and what it made the New York Times papers and so on. If it didn't happen in New York, it sort of didn't happen. And some of the people like Rod Stewart and others coming out of America, out of England rather, accepting for the Beatles. you didn't really know. I mean, I got into Rod Stewart and Joe Cocker sometime later because they weren't big in New York and they weren't big in that side of America. They were anything that happens off the American coastline doesn't happen for Americans, and that was it. But the John Lennon story is funny. I interviewed George Harrison a couple of times in Midday, and he was wonderful. He was wonderfully eloquent in that sort of dry Liverpudlian way that he had, and a lovely sense of humour. And I interviewed Ringo Starr, not Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney, interesting. I did a series of 30 shows more recent times with Sir David Attenborough, and the Australian entrepreneur who brought out David Attenborough, and I used to ride shotgun with David on live shows that we did, and 5,000 people in the audience would sell out almost overnight with David Attenborough, and so on the strength of that first one, the entrepreneur said, let's try and get Sir Paul McCartney, and we'll bring him to Australia. And the idea would be it was just maybe a guitar number at the start, and we'd talk about the Beatles days in Liverpool and so on, and then we'd take an interval, and then we'd have a piano number at the second half, and the rest would just be a conversation with Sir Paul, and so with Paul McCartney. And so they got in touch with Paul McCartney's management team, who were in South America, in Rio at the time, playing for a football stadium. We're talking about probably 2010, 2011. And so they got in touch and said, we've done this thing with Sir David Attenborough, and we'd like to do something with Sir Paul. And they came back and said, look, on the strength of that, we've spoken to him. He's very keen to do it. He understands what Sir David's done. Our fee would be £120 million. 120 million pounds, and we're only talking about a show in Melbourne and Sydney and probably New York and Washington and Ottawa and London, and that was all. But 120 million pound, that was the starting base. Anyway, never happened. So that was the closest I got to Paul McCartney. But when Diana, my wife, and I first went to New York, we were. It was like 1972, 73. One afternoon we were coming out of Central Park. It was summertime and like 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and the sun was still out. And John Lennon and Yoko lived across the other side of the park where he was subsequently shot and killed outside. And so they were heading across on the Fifth Avenue side of Central Park, for those who know America, New York. And he bounced into the park as we were leaving with Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton was in a band with at the time, and John Lennon had a number one hit, and he had a band with Yoko and Eric Clapton and a few other wonderful American musicians, and Richard Nixon was the president, and Richard Nixon was trying to kick him out of America. He was anti-Vietnam. John was anti-Vietnam and getting a lot of attention, and was outspoken, as he always was, about civil rights as well, and etc. So Nixon tried to get him out, and John Lennon and friends fought through the American court system, and he was allowed to stay. But he was a very prominent figure, and he bounced into the park with a leather pork pie cap on, I remember, and these aviator glasses, and she had the same gear on. He had this wonderfully, what looked expensive, flying jacket, a black leather jacket, and she had the same, and Eric Clapton was in a check shirt, I remember. And they sort of just came almost across our path. And I did something I've never done before in my life or since. I'm not a stalker of stars. And I said, "G'day, John." And he stopped in the middle of nowhere. I said it quite loudly. And he stopped, and obviously he heard a Cockney accent or something different. He had no idea who I was, of course. And he stopped and for a moment smiled, this incredible, sparkling smile and a twinkle of the eyes, and said, "G'day." And then he went. And three of them went off as they were talking. It was just stop, "G'day, John, g'day." And my wife said, "What did you do that for?" And I said, "It was John Lennon." And she said, "You idiot, why would you do that?" And she walked away. She was offended by me saying, "G'day, John." And I said, "Well, it's John Lennon." I was trying to explain to myself, as I say, something I never do was my brush with fame. But he went, again, never to be interviewed by me and never to be seen by me. But if you're a journalist for long enough, the cycle of life is such that 10 years later, I was on 60 Minutes, and I went back to when he was shot and killed outside his apartment that he was heading for that day. And I covered that, his murder. And 20 years after that, I was there with our daughter Jenna when she left school, and she and I, once she finished high school, we had this deal. We were going to do a week of it's just she and I in New York looking at theatre because she loves theatre. And that was December again. I didn't know it was the anniversary. It was 20 years to the day after he was shot that I was with Jenna in Central Park on an afternoon and around that area, which is Strawberry Fields, just below where John Lennon lived. And that's now sort of dedicated to the Beatles. And there were probably 2,000 people there with guitars singing not just John Lennon songs, but Beatles songs, and others were sitting around like us and just, basically taking in, if you like, basking in the history of and the memory of what was Lennon and what was the Beatles. And I thought that incredible cycle of life that you have, that if you live long enough, you're there one day when you say, "G'day, John," and you're there 10 years later when he's assassinated, and you're there 20 years later after that with your daughter in another generation saying, well, this amazing thing happened. And she of course had grown up as people do, even young people today, on the Beatles. And it was that extraordinary, privilege again that you get.
Big moments like that when John Lennon was killed. I mean, everyone remembers where they were when these huge moments in history occurred. How does that work as a journalist? You have said to me you were a massive John Lennon fan.
Mm-hmm,
you get
absolutely.
this terrible news that he's been murdered in New York, but you've got a job to do to go and cover that. Are you able as a journalist to create that gap required to remain professional and to stay removed from the story when thousands of people all around you are losing their minds and breaking down and suffering through this terrible event? Is it possible as a journalist to remove yourself from that and just get on with the job and try and separate yourself from the emotions of these big events?
I think you have to, but you can't always do it. I think what you do is you bring to something like that, or something that moves you emotionally, hopefully you write better and you tell the story better. To know what Ali had, what he'd been and what he became when he became just a sort of shattered. On that same trip with Jenna, we were walking down 57th Street and we were stopped by a black car and a red carpet that went into the Russian tea room on 57th Street, which is a fantastic restaurant. And we stopped to see what was happening, and there was a nurse with this shuffling African-American man who was Ali. And it was Ali in the last year or so of his life. And once again, I was there with my daughter, and I was able to say when he was the prettiest, as he called himself, but the most handsome, best-known man in the world, Muhammad Ali. And here he was now, this sort of shuffling wreck of a man from what he'd been. And that, once again, that's the cycle of life that happens in some ways to all of us. I could tell a better story about seeing Ali there because I'd seen him in that fight and because I thought he was, close to the greatest athlete I ever saw in my life. Similarly with John Lennon, writing about John Lennon, or writing about the tsunami in Aceh, where 200,000 people were killed and their bodies around there, is something that moves anybody emotionally. I think that you probably write better, and probably your choice of adjectives and your choice of the way you describe it is probably stronger and more powerful than if you don't care. But I don't think at the end of the day, if you're writing a news story, you should just tell the news story. But if you're writing a colour story, if you're doing something for 60 Minutes or for Four Corners, I think, as against a news bulletin, then I think you've got a chance to put your own feelings and your own emotions in there. And I think you're expected to, and you probably do a better job. There's
a criticism that's levelled against journalism in general today that it's overwhelmingly negative, that if it bleeds, it leads. There's a focus on these stories, and I think there's a feeling that there's the world is in some ways a sad place, and the press is responsible for that to some extent. Do you agree with that? And have you seen journalism change in the way those stories are told? Was it always the case that the saddest and most tragic stories were the ones that made the front pages?
I think it was. Except that now we've got 24-hour news, and so you can't get away from it. I go away nowadays overseas for a time, and I don't read the Australian papers for a couple of weeks, and I come back, and apart from, let's say, Bob Hawke's death or something really prominent like that, nothing's changed. And so you can survive without the news. You can't survive without information. You need information, but you can survive without the daily news. And I used to, when I was fronting a current affair, when I was also working on 60 Minutes and the Midday Show, the most common refrain is, why is it always bad news? Why do we always focus on ugly people or people who are negative or people who do bad things? Why, I live in a neighbourhood in which people don't do bad things. The kids go to school and they cuddle the kids and the kids play football or netball, and life goes on and people care about the local dogs. And that's true. I mean, thankfully for our society in Australia, most people do care and they look after each other. And I think that's an understandable refrain from everybody that, why can't we cover stories of good people? Why do we always cover stories of ratbags or of bad people? And I think when I was doing all those programs, I used to believe that we should go and do some stories on people who do good works. And the Australian awards that are given out a couple of times a year usually so often forget the prominent people who get them, and probably shouldn't. It's the scoutmaster from Wagga, or it's the lady who looks after the Meals on Wheels in somewhere else, or it's someone who looks after the gardens in a particular town off their own bat and so on. We do give awards for people who do these fantastic things, and you and I have talked about them, and we all talk about them over dinner. There's something in the news about someone unknown who's done remarkable things. So there should be more of that, and that's not being Pollyanna-ish. News has to be about things that get your attention, and so often they're about things that are almost like warnings, if you like, or things that are exceptional and out of the ordinary, and crime is out of the ordinary in Australia, and violence is out of the ordinary. So it gets covered. But I do think we forget some of the extraordinary people who aren't famous, and even some of the famous, the Dick Smiths of this world, who give every year give a couple of $1 million to charity every year. He and Mrs. Smith, Pip give money every year. Now it should be lauded. We should pat people on the back who do that. They don't have to do it, and lots of rich people don't, but people like Dick do. And so I think that as a journalist, I find myself all the time looking for the extraordinary, which doesn't have to be a star. It's often the extraordinary is done by people who are very ordinary.
Of all these wonderful people that you've had the privilege of interviewing, from presidents to prime ministers to rock stars, was there ever the one that got away? Who was the person that you most wanted to speak to and hoped that you would be able to sit down with that you never got the chance to?
Oh, the one I don't know whether I'd ever thought I had a chance, but the Queen would be the one missing link, the one that I'd love to talk to. The Pope at the time as well, because of the power, the influence that they have, and because they're usually remarkable people. The Queen especially. I'm a Republican, and so I think the sooner we get rid of the Queen of Australia and she remains the Queen of England or the King of England, will suit me. I want the English flag off our flag, but nevertheless, I think the Queen is a remarkable woman and a remarkable person, and given what she's seen and what she's done over those years, I'd love to talk to her. She's been, the change of government recently with Boris Johnson. I mean, I'd love to hear what she thinks of Boris Johnson. But you'd hope that you could actually talk to her about, without any filters and without any censorship. And if she gave the inside story of the things she's seen in her period of reign, it would be, comparable, if not more than what Queen Victoria had there. So the Queen I'd love to ask the Queen what she has in her handbag. What does she carry in that handbag? She doesn't have the car keys, and she obviously doesn't have there's no credit card, and there's no purse. She might have some rouge, but she's got a lady in waiting to touch up the lipstick. And I suspect that her handbag is like something from Fortnum and Mason's that's just got rolled up paper in there, and it's really just there to keep the size of the shape of the bag. There's really nothing in there because there's someone alongside her who will give her what she needs every time. And so I'd love to know what the Queen has in her handbag.
Ray, that's something I've always admired about your interview style, is you're able to find those angles, that common element that makes that finds a new way to tell the story, like asking the Queen what she's got in her handbag. How do you do that? If you're interviewing a famous person that's been asked the same question a million times, how do you find that angle that's going to hopefully bring them out and reveal them more as a human being rather than just a celebrity?
You do your homework. I'm an absolute stickler for getting information. If I interviewed you, I would want to know more about you than you know yourself. And when you tell me things that should surprise me, I'll act surprised. But I really want to know in advance how many children you have and what your wife's name is and that sort of stuff. That's I'm amazed sometimes journalists will talk to me and my wife's name is spelled Dianne, E, and they won't even know that. There's a journalist who research has, spells her name differently to what it is, and has no idea. So those sorts of things I just think are not journalism. You need to know. So then to find something that that Rod Stewart or John Lennon's been asked the same questions 1,000 times, and how to get something different. I mean, I thought when I did the great debates with John Howard and with Paul Keating for Channel 9, the first of those, it just seemed to me, given the money that was being thrown around by both sides of politics at that stage, it seemed to me worthwhile to ask them how much a loaf of bread was. Because they deal in terms of, $120 million was spent on the same-sex vote. Postal vote. We knew what the results were, and yet it was thrown away like spare change on that particular vote. And I think generally that even working class people like Paul Keating or John Howard, for that matter, they forget what it's like in the real world, and they don't go and buy a loaf of bread, or they don't buy a litre of milk. Now, that's not a silly question. It's a question of, how much in touch with the real world are you? Because someone buys the loaf of bread for them or buys the milk. So I think that sort of question is valid. Often it gets a lovely response. I did an introduction for Julian Lennon. He was on Midday, and John Lennon's son, and he came on and he had Sweetwater or Saltwater, a song at the time.
Saltwater,
a song which was an international hit. And I wrote the introduction. I was doing Midday, and I wrote the introduction. And I never mentioned John Lennon. I just said this young guy from California, and he's written this song that's taken the world, and it's an environmental song, and he's got an album out that's so and so and so and so. And it was fairly a fulsome introduction. And I never mentioned John. He came out just cacking himself, just laughing so much. So, my God, he said, that's the first time in my life someone didn't mention that I was John Lennon's son. And he said it. And the end result, he gave a great interview. And it was just that attempt. I thought, hey, what else will we do that's different? And without trying to be different in a silly way. But I just thought, how will he respond if I don't mention John Lennon? Because he's a man in his own right, and that was the response. So often I think it's that question, like the loaf of bread question or the others, that will get a different response. Jack Lemmon, I interviewed him once, and he'd been in an American movie, and he had 58 interviews about that movie at the time, and we were pre-recording the interview, and we were the last one, and they gave us half an hour with him, and most of the others were 8 minutes and 9 minutes just for local news programs around the world. And I got to the end of it and about to do the interview with him, and Jack Lemmon said, Ray, I'd never met him, he was in Hollywood and I was here, and he said, this is the 58th interview I've done today and yesterday. He said, would you mind if I had a cup of tea? And I said, of course, Jack, please be my guest. I knew we'd get half an hour anyway. So he had the cup of tea and he calmed down a bit and we were just chatting about nothing, and then we started the interview and the clock began with our half hour. And I asked him something which was, not like the price of eggs or the price of a loaf of bread, but I asked him something about the movie, about acting. And I know in 58 interviews, he must have been asked that question at least 20 times, if not more. He said, Ray, that's a damn good question. I don't know that. Well, let me think about that. Now, it was just because he was such great talent, and the end result, it makes, puffs up your image of, that's a good question, if you say to the person doing the interviews. Now, I thought at the time, how good are you? How good are you? Because that was the right sort of answer. And he ended up giving me an answer. And as I say, it wasn't a left or right field question. It was something that I'm sure he'd been asked as well. That's a good question. Let me think how I answer that in the way you went. So that's the cleverness of someone who knows the media.
Who was the biggest disappointment that you spoke to? Who didn't live up to their stature when you actually sat down and spoke to them one-on-one?
Michael Johnson, the American 400 metres champion, probably the greatest 400 metre runner in the world, or distance runner in the world, African-American, won the same night that Kathy Freeman won the gold for 400 metres. He won it for the 400 in the men, and then won the 4x400 relay. We were asked at 60 Minutes to do a story, a day in the life of Michael, and he was a 6'5" fellow from Texas, and it was his last Olympic Games in Sydney. And he was about to become the Goodwill ambassador for Brisbane. And they were paying, I think the state government with Peter Beattie at that stage was paying $100,000 as a goodwill ambassador. He was going to come back, not run, but come back and promote the games in Brisbane. And so they said, could you do a day in the life of? And I'd read that he was difficult. And so I remember saying to Peter Beattie's people, does he want to do it? Is he really, are we going to have a trouble? No, he wants to do it. He wants to do it. He didn't want to do it. And I won't go through. He did early morning FM radio with Agro up there in Brisbane, and we filmed that at about 5:30 in the morning. And they wrote in the diary, impossible, never to be interviewed again. He was so difficult, it was just monosyllabic. And he had his sunglasses on in the studio. It was pitch black, and he had his sunglasses when he walked out of the big limo that we took around. And we were in South. I won't go through the rest of it, but we were in across the river in Brisbane, just wanting to get a shot of him sort of wandering around where the people were. And a woman came across with a baby. She was swimming there at a bit of a sort of a beach they have on the South Bank. And she said, Michael, can I get a photograph of the baby? And he said, no photographs. And the woman looked at me, and I was embarrassed. I sort of raised my hand and said, I don't know why. And anyway, no photographs. And a couple of young blokes came out off a building nearby with their iPhones and said, Michael, can we get an autograph? Gordon, no autograph? And he said, no autographs. And the same thing. And they said, why? No autographs. So I knew it was going to be a difficult day. And I said to him, as we stood by the river, look, I'm going to make this as painless as I possibly can for you. We're just doing a day in the life of. And so I said, we just like to hear what you've got to say about the Sydney Olympics, what you think of Cathy Freeman, and what you think of yourself in terms of what you've done. So generally, that's the area we're going to go. And he said, I won't use the language, but he said, I don't give a what's the name about Sydney. I couldn't give a what's the name about Cathy Freeman. And I'm sick of what's the name talking about myself. And I said, well, it's going to be a good interview for sure. Now, it wasn't. It got worse. And I asked about drugs when I'd been told not to. But drugs was the big issue with the Americans at the Sydney Olympics when Five got sent home. And we had to ask about drugs, which I left at the end. And he stood up in the interview, and we had 3 cameras on it. And I thought he was going to hit me. He was so angry, saying that I'm not going to talk about drugs, and I'm not involved in drugs. And I'm not suggesting that he was. But the American team had been. And I thought, at the time, please hit me. Because we had 3 cameras. But I thought, don't hit me hard, because you hit me hard, you're going to knock me into next week. And he didn't. He went out saying, well, when I come back for the Goodwill Games, there's someone I'm not going to be talking to, and that's you. And I said, well, effectively tell someone who cares at that stage. It had been so difficult all the way through it. And we ran the story, including a bit of that. But I reckon I got probably 100 letters, and 80 said, why were you so rude to Michael Johnson? So how do you explain? So he was, I expected him, because I'm a sports nut, as I said, and I expected him to be fantastic, as Americans are, and he could have easily dealt with the drug question and said, I'm not involved, and moved on. The tag to that story, Matt, is that he retired then. The rest of the relay team, the other 3 members, kept running, and about 6 months later, they were all 3 found positive on the juice, and they had to give back their Sydney medals. And he gave his medal back because he said if the other 3 were on drugs, then obviously they cheated, and he couldn't afford to have it. But so that was the tag to the story. I'm not for a moment suggesting he was on drugs, but nevertheless, it was the others were, and they paid for it.
Ray, you've covered just so many amazing chapters of history. Why do you think it's important that we remember these things about history? Because there is a feeling today that people say, why do you want to live in the past? History's not important. What does it matter? From your perspective of having covered these vitally important world-changing events, why is it important we remember history? Why is it important that we learn from what's happened before?
Well, I confess that I'm a history nut, so that I think it's important, as I'm sure scientists think. Science is more important than I do, even though I love science. But why is history important? You drive through an Australian country town and you see a grand hotel or a grand building that has the date on the top, 1914. And you think, 1915, and you think, wow, this is when we first started to send men to the Western Front, 1916. And what a glorious moment it would have been in this country town's life for this big emporium with this big hotel to open up. but at the very time we were sending men off to die, or men were going off to die. And the same as, a hotel called the Hotel Australia is usually built in the 1890s, and it's the time when Australia's decided to become a federation. And it's important. It's not just a hotel that's called the Hotel Australia. It was called that because the Australian Federation was important when we came together from these separate colonies to form one nation. And it's the same, when you talk about 50 years since man stepped on the moon, when you think that if you don't know that the computers used to put man on the moon were almost what you could put in an iPhone these days, almost, in terms of and these incredibly brave men and those who sent them there, who are also incredibly skilled and brave to take the risk, were like Captain Cook coming to the east coast of Australia. They went to the dark side of the moon if for Captain Cook, but they literally went with the two men and Michael Collins who flew around the moon. If you don't know that, you have no context for life. And I think that it's not just the old cliche about that you commit the same sins if you don't know what you've done in the past. As a society, you do need to know who we are and where we've come from. And I think that's, in that sense, that's what history does. History tells you about this sort of multicultural society we've got. And when I grew up, it was basically Irish, English, with a few Greeks and a few Italians and a few more Chinese. Now we're a multicultural example, I think, for the world. And really, we're just a shining light of what we do. If you don't know where these people came from and their history and what they contribute to Australia, if you don't know why we don't have cities in the centre of Australia, or if you don't know why you drive around Australian roads and about every hour in a car there's another town. Well, that was the distance when bullocks would be able to travel in a day, etc. And that's the reason. And obviously they're alongside rivers, and there's reason why. All that, the historical thing of what Ballarat and Bendigo made Melbourne the second richest city in the British Commonwealth after London for a time there, and was immensely wealthy in Melbourne. And we, an opera house in Ballarat or Bendigo, is it, where the big opera house is, and so on. All these things were not there because they wanted an opera house there. It was there because gold was fueling Australia's economy as sheep had done beforehand, and all these things. So it's why would we go? Why did we stop in Albany before we headed off to Egypt and then went off to the Western Front and went off to fight in the First World War? Because that was the last bit of Australia they ever saw, and why Albany is important today in who we are. I can't imagine as I say, much as I love science, I can't imagine just being, a nation or a people who are concerned about facts and figures in the scientific or the mathematical world. That it's that social world that we can't explain, what divided Australia in World War I, in that sectarianism, the why the Catholics were against, supporting the Brits in World War I, and yet why young men who are Catholics joined up and went across and almost defying their church and that sort of stuff. And I tell my children, when I grew up in a place like Gunnedah, where Protestants would cross over the road rather than walk past the Catholic Church because they were Protestants, and that was the sectarianism in Australia. If you don't know that, you don't understand who we are and how much we've come to where they can laugh at that sort of fact, where you could have a legal firm or an accountancy firm in Sydney or Melbourne that was totally Catholic or totally Protestant, and never the twain should meet, and those sorts of things. So I think it's that if you don't know our history, then you don't know who we are, and then you don't know who you are.
All right, it's been absolutely wonderful. What are you working on now? What's the next project we're going to see Ray Martin associated with?
I'm doing. I've become obsessive photographer, so I've got an exhibition. In fact, the Biennale photo exhibition in a couple of months in Ballarat and Bendigo. That with a friend, I'm doing an exhibition there. I'm doing another exhibition up at Ken Duncan's gallery. Beyond that, I'm still trying to write a book on Fred Hollows. I've been writing for some time. I was chairman of the Fred Hollows Foundation, and I think my holy trinity of people, the 10,000 plus interviews, that the most remarkable people I met happen to be men, I'm sorry, but I've met some remarkable women as well. But Fred Hollows, Don Bradman, David Attenborough would have been my holy trinity in terms of the most remarkable men that I've met in that period of time. And I've been I knew Fred, he was a friend, and his family want me to do the book, and I'm about a third of the way through the book, but I keep doing other things, and as a result I put it on the back burner. But I'd seriously like to do that before I'm unable to do it. I'm doing a lot of travel, and I'm doing some stuff for SBS, and I'm doing some stuff for Channel 7 coming up. I'm sort of a gun for hire, if you like, at the moment. I'm in that enviable position of just doing things that I want to do. If I don't want to do it, I don't do it, generally. And that's, you can't do it when you're a young man and you're trying to pay the mortgage, and you're trying to get your kids through school, but I'm past that, and so I can just do things that please me, and figuring that I've got a limited amount of time, and I want to do things that I like. And, the trip to the Western Front is one of those things that I'm really looking forward to, I want to do. And that's why it's going to be so enjoyable, I think, to do it. But I just do, I write whenever I like. If I get asked to write stuff for newspapers and magazines, which I do, I love to do. So it's doing things that please me.
Well, Ray, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely wonderful. And as we said at the start of the interview, I'm really looking forward to our tour coming up to hitting the battlefields and to hearing your insights, your great insights into the history that went on there, and your knowledge and skill about photography as well. I think is going to greatly enhance that experience. So
I think we'll learn together, though. I mean, you already know, and I love sort of basking in your wisdom and sitting there in that. But I think beyond that, even though I do know, and I've read an awful lot about this, I'm still going there. I haven't been to those areas. So like the rest of the people going on this trip, it'll be a journey in which we discover together what it's about with the historians and you, and whatever insight. There'll be people on the trip for sure who have relatives who served there or even died there for obvious reasons, and they're going on the trip. And it'd be great to hear their stories. It's great to hear what, suddenly the perspective of someone who sees one of these Western Front graveyards and that run on, as we know, for as far as the eye could see almost. And you get some sense, as I said earlier, of even 200,000 people dying in Aceh in the tsunami there, that, when you see that many body bags around an area, you think, my God, I mean, how devastatingly destructive was that tsunami? Well, how devastatingly destructive was World War I, and to see row after row of gravestones, and they're just the ones that we recovered, and so on. So I'm looking forward to it. Yes, knowing a lot about it and having read a lot about it, but I really want to go and see it for myself and feel it and smell it and hear the wisdom of the people with us, and if you like, we all discover it together. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
It's going to be a great journey of discovery, as you say, and so anyone listening, if you want to come along with us, please do check out our website and join Ray and I on that tour. It's going to be quite extraordinary. And Ray, it's just been wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you so much. We'll have you on again sometime in the future, but thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Matt. Terrific.